So the idea for this talk started when there were fires at UCT, at the UCT library. And of course, it was such a devastating fire. And so much was lost in that fire. So I was having a conversation with a friend about things lost in the fire. And of course, they said there was something like 700 books that, that burnt. And, but I was thinking a lot about how we've come to value the written word as a means of documenting knowledge and history. And of course, you and I are writers, so of course we're part of that system. But of course, we know as Indigenous people that there have been other ways traditionally of recording and transmitting knowledge. And so I was going back to thinking about our relationship with oral history and oral storytelling. Yes. And I was thinking so much about how much of what goes into my books comes from things I was told in person, or comes from, growing up around elders who told stories and instead of writing them down, right? Yes. So that I have a very intimate relationship with oral storytelling. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about your relationship with oral storytelling and how it has shaped you as a storyteller and as a writer and as an artist.
Oh my goodness. In fact, indeed, you will find that many of us who grew up in a storytelling environment, have had that intimate relationship with oral storytelling, the oral tradition, and so on. In my case, in fact, I believe that I've been shaped by that literature, the oral literature, or orature as they sometimes call it. Yeah. I believe that I've been shaped by orature even more than other forms of literature, written or otherwise. Yeah. For instance, I grew up in Johannesburg. I grew up in Orlando East and then later in Dobsonville. Yeah. But every time when it's December, we would go to the Eastern Cape, which was the tradition those days. You find that during the December holidays for Christmas, people leave Johannesburg and go, those who still have a connection with some rural area somewhere, yeah. they go there, to celebrate with extended family, their relatives, and so on. So it was the same case with us. Yeah. And indeed, when we got there, then you'll find that, all the kids from, different, because you see, we go to my grandmother's and grandfather's homestead. Yeah. And all their grandchildren would be there as well. Some coming from Cape Town, from Johannesburg, others from locally there. And in the evenings, it would happen that almost every evening, in fact, as she is cooking there or other women are cooking, we are sitting around the fire and stories are told. Mm. Now, these were traditional stories. These were classical stories, stories that were passed from one generation to the next, as they were. In other words, you didn't mess up with those stories because they must come down from your great, great, great grandmothers, the way they are. Yeah. So we would listen to these stories, and then we would also tell those that we know. But then there would be an occasion during the process of storytelling where then somebody would say, now is the time for improvising a story. It's called ukuqweba ibali.
Yeah.
This is the time for it to improvise your own stories now. That's when then you find that many of us would try to invent our stories. In many instances, they are based on the form of the classical stories, but the content would be different because it would be the kind of content that was about our lives, our present lives.
Yeah.
So we would display our skills then, on improvising a story which would be funny, would make people laugh, and so on. Little did we know that that was part of the process of training us to be storytellers, not just tellers or repeaters of the ancient stories, but composers of our own stories.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that when I was writing literary fiction
Yeah.
or plays and so on, I drew a lot from those stories that were told then. And in many instances, even my earliest play, which I'll say For the Fatherland, I found that I was writing it exactly in the form that my grandmother used to tell the stories. I was not aware, but for me, that's how stories were told generally.
Yeah.
And then when critics read it, they said, "Oh, this is magic realism." Now, I never set out to write magic realism. I was just telling a story.
Yeah.
And the only way of telling the story that I knew was the way of my grandmother.
Would you classify that as a form of knowledge transmission? Like, would you say that there was the history of the people that was coming down through those stories and people's beliefs and people's spiritual practices? Was that also part of what was going on within those stories that would be given to the children?
Yes, but to a much lesser degree, because in many instances, these stories are in fact morality tales, morality stories, which were much more concerned with behavior and, the norms, the moral and ethical norms of the community, as practiced by the characters in the stories, which was, in most cases would be animals, but there would be human beings, Tutsilane, Lidimo, and so on and so forth. You'll see. There were those stories, of course, the stories I'm talking about. You'll find that the reservoir of these stories would be women, mothers, but most importantly, grandmothers. There were stories that were quite different. For instance, genealogies, which then would contain history. Those came from the men. Stories of what in my language they call imvelapi, in other words, where we come from. For instance, I could recite my genealogy for many, many generations, up to 20, from the time my people left the Great Lakes. So you can imagine that must be more than 800 years ago.
Yeah.
From that time, from Usibiside, who's the elder who led his people from the Great Lakes down to Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And I recite now, Sibiside gave birth to so-and-so, so-and-so, there was a lot of people, so-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so. Sometimes these will just be names, but in other instances, you would find that when that particular person had something interesting that he did or was done to him, that will be mentioned. So-and-so who did A, B, C, and D. And then we pass on to the next name, to the next name. So you find that you have your whole genealogy for generations and generations and generations. And the keepers of that then would be the men. So obviously that happens when you are a bit older.
Yes.
When you are no longer sitting there and listening to the stories that come from the grandmother.
Right.
Yeah.
So why was there this division then, where the stories that men told were so different from the ones that the women told?
Because their lives were all different. Because ours were patriarchal societies even then, although it was a different kind of patriarchy from the one that was introduced by the British.
Yeah.
But the British, came with their very pointed kind of patriarchy. But even before they came, our environment was quite patriarchal in that the men still saw themselves as the head, of the household, of the extended family. It would be the elder. The matriarch would still be respected. She had her own department in many different things.
Right.
That is why even the stories, you see, the stories of genealogies, the keepers of those stories would be the elderly men who then teach the younger men. There were even other stories which were even much more religious that you would learn when you go for initiation and circumcision. You see. So those were narratives that were much, much more religious in nature, you see. Yeah. So, I mean, there were those compartments where you find that. And then there would be, of course, praise poetry, which also contained the history.
Yeah.
But in that case, more than just the history of the individual, it would contain the history of the nation, of the community, of the society, you see, but told through the ruling elites, through the chiefs of the time and the generals and the wars that they fought and so on and so forth. So you got this history from those who told you genealogies, but you also got it from those who told you about the rulers and the wars, exactly like the griotic tradition of West Africa.
Yes.
And then, of course, there were those stories about behavior and morality that came in many instances from the women. Right. And these stories were so important that they were exported from Africa to what was called then the New World, which was South America and North America. Because at one stage, I met Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in one of these writers' conferences.
Yeah.
This one was in Spain.
Yeah.
And he was telling us that, people, excuse me, people, talk of my magic realism, but my magic actually is different from Günter Grass, the German author, magic.
Yeah.
Günter Grass magic, is created by the author. He invents all these strange places. So Marquez was saying his magic actually comes from the society, the community itself. In that the traditions and the legends and all those things, the spirituality and so on of the people, when these authors use it, they write of it, and all those things are very magical, those two. They write of the beliefs of the people as if they were objective reality. Which means that the magic itself is created, by the beliefs of those communities. And of course, in Colombia, where he lived and wrote, you know, you have a very strong community that descended from the African slaves.
Yes.
So Marquez was telling us that his magic comes from his grandmother. And then he's asking us, now, do you guys know where my grandmother got her magic? Then he answers himself, says, my grandmother got her magic from the old African women, the African slaves who were brought to Colombia, you know, centuries ago. So that's what fascinated me to say that his magic and mine have the same source.
Yeah, yeah.
The African grandmother.
Yeah, yeah.
During COVID, among the books that I completed, because there was this lockdown that was happening then, was a libretto for an opera about my great, well, I don't know how many greats there, but it was in the 1700s when we calculate generations. Remember, I told you that we know our genealogy.
Yes.
So when we calculate that roughly, you know, a generation is so many years, and that is very roughly so many years. This was around the 1730, long before colonialism.
Wow.
My great-great-grandmother, whose name was Mamani, who was our people are called Amampondomise. She was a princess of the Amampondomise people.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when her father died, she insisted that she was taking over, even though that was against the tradition. When I say our cultures were patriarchal even those days, because only the male heir would be made king.
Yeah.
But Mamani insisted that she's going to be king. And this is history. And she was so powerful that she had a lot of the military class supporting her, because they believed, you know, in her magic. They said, this person has some aura, you know, about her. And indeed, she did become king, not queen, but king. Yeah. And then she demanded that she wanted to marry another woman. She had rejected many suitors, men who came, you know, who wanted to marry her then. Yeah. And they were even wondering, what's wrong with Mama? Her younger sisters, both of them have been married, they have children and so on. She's rejecting everybody. When she was king, then she instructed that they must go and fetch a specific woman from the Amampondo people, a daughter of Nyauza, who then was brought. They paid lobola for her, and she got married to Mamani. That was the first known, you know, sanctioned by the nation same-sex marriage.
Wow.
So I wrote this libretto for opera. Yeah. And I'm working with two composers now. One here in Johannesburg, Florence Masebe's daughter, who's a concert pianist, but a very good composer. Another one who's a descendant of this very same people I'm talking about, who's a lecturer in New York, the Manhattan School of Music teaching. And this will be done by the Cape Town Opera, jointly with the Baxter Theatre and the UCT School of Music. You see, right. Wow. In preparation for a festival in July next year.
Wow.
So that story, that lesbian woman was my great-great-great-grandmother.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting and complex story, because now when she was supposed to have an heir, she insisted that her brother, Singo,
Yeah.
should make love to her wife.
Wow.
Then the wife got pregnant, and that's how then the heir came into being, the heir to the throne. Yeah.
Wow. So it was still, the heir was still blood related to her, but not from her. She didn't give birth to the heir, but it was still, but it was still her blood.
Yes, it was her brother. The father was her brother, the father of the heir.
Wow.
Yeah.
And in passing that story down, was there some kind of moral judgment around?
Oh yes, oh yes. There's moral judgment now as we speak. Because you see, fortunately, you see these stories are kept by our storytellers, our imbongis, and so on and so forth, who then passed it. There's a white man in Grahamstown there. I just forget his name, Schwab, who wrote a lot of these stories from our poets, which means that now this one was written already in the early century, in early last century. Yeah. By this person who was collecting these histories. Yeah. But our poets still tell that story. What is happening with the elders of Amampondomise, who are my people? They are very angry with me, because they say to me, now remember, these are people who have been Christianized. Now the British came with Christianity and so on, which was very homophobic and all that. So they are as homophobic as the British who taught them homophobia. You see that? So they are ashamed of Mama. That is why even when they recite the genealogies, they will come with genealogy, so-and-so begot so-and-so, so then they skip Mamani. And then they talk of her son, to talk, you know, who became the king next, and then da-da-da-da. Yeah. You see? They skip Mamani, and they say so. To me, they say, now you are coming with these newfangled ideas of yours. Why do you think that we no longer recite Mamani's name in our genealogies? It's because Mamani shamed us. You see, you are embarrassing us when you bring these old stories that we would rather forget. Right. But of course, history does not forget, you see. No, of course. So I tell them that, you know, for me, I see Mamani as a hero, you see. Yes. And you should not be ashamed of your history, because that's where you come from, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Yes. And of course, for me, Mamani falls under the good rather than the bad or the ugly.